Augustan Literature, 1700 to 1750. During the 18th century, literature reflected the worldview of the Age of Enlightenment, or Age of Reason, a rational and scientific approach to religious, social, political, and economic issues that promoted a secular view of the world and a general sense of progress and perfectibility. Led by the philosophers who were inspired by the discoveries of the previous century by people like Isaac Newton and the writings of Descartes, John Locke, and Francis Bacon. They sought to discover and to act upon universally valid principles governing humanity, nature, and society. They variously attacked spiritual and scientific authority, dogmatism, intolerance, censorship, and economic and social restraints. They considered the state the proper and rational instrument of progress. The extreme rationalism and skepticism of the age led naturally to deism and also played a part in bringing the later reaction of Romanticism. The Encyclopédie of Denis Diderot epitomized the spirit of the age. The term Augustan literature derives from authors of the 1720s and 1730s themselves, who responded to a term that George I of England preferred for himself. While George I meant the title to reflect his might, they instead saw in it a reflection of ancient Rome's transition from rough and ready literature to highly political and highly polished literature. It is an age of exuberance and scandal, of enormous energy and inventiveness and outrage, that reflected an era when English, Welsh, Scottish, and Irish people found themselves in the midst of an expanding economy, lowering barriers to education, and the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. Poetry. It was during this time that poet James Thomson, 1700 to 1748, produced his melancholy The Seasons, 1728-30, and Edward Young, 1681 to 1765, wrote his poem Night Thoughts, 1742, though the most outstanding poet of the age is Alexander Pope, 1688 to 1744. It is also the era that saw a serious competition over the proper model for the pastoral. In criticism, poets struggled with the doctrine of decorum, of matching proper words with proper sense and of achieving a diction that matched the gravity of a subject. At the same time, the mock heroic was at its zenith, and Pope's Rape of the Lock, 1712-17, and the Dunciad, 1728-43 are still the greatest mock heroic poems ever written. Pope also translated the Iliad, 1715-20, and the Odyssey, 1725-26. Since his death, Pope has been in a constant state of re-evaluation. Drama. Drama in the early part of the period featured the last plays of John Vanbrugh and William Congreve, both of whom carried on the Restoration comedy with some alterations. However, the majority of stagings were of lower farces and much more serious and domestic tragedies. George Lillo and Richard Steele both produced highly moral forms of tragedy, where the characters and the concerns of the characters were wholly middle class or working class. This reflected a marked change in the audience for plays, as royal patronage was no longer the important part of theatrical success. Additionally, Colley Cibber and John Rich began to battle each other for greater and greater spectacles to present on stage. The figure of Harlequin was introduced, and pantomime theatre began to be staged. This low comedy was quite popular, and the plays became tertiary to the staging. Opera also began to be popular in London, and there was significant literary resistance to this Italian incursion. In 1728 John Gay returned to the playhouse with The Beggar's Opera. The Licensing Act 1737 brought an abrupt halt to much of the period's drama, as the theatres were once again brought under state control. Prose, including the novel. In prose, the earlier part of the period was overshadowed by the development of the English essay. Joseph Addison and Richard Steele's The Spectator established the form of the British periodical essay. However, this was also the time when the English novel was first emerging. Daniel Defoe turned from journalism and writing criminal lives for the press to writing fictional criminal lives with Roxana and Moll Flounders. He also wrote Robinson Crusoe, 1719. If Addison and Steele were dominant in one type of prose, then Jonathan Swift, author of the satire Gulliver's Travels, was in another. In A Modest Proposal and The Drapier Letters, Swift reluctantly defended the Irish people from the predations of colonialism. This provoked riots and arrests, but Swift, who had no love of Irish Roman Catholics, was outraged by the abuses he saw. An effect of the Licensing Act of 1737 was to cause more than one aspiring playwright to switch over to writing novels. Henry Fielding, 1707–1754, began to write prose satire and novels after his plays could not pass the censors. In the interim, Samuel Richardson, 1689–1761, had produced Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, 1740, and Henry Fielding attacked what he saw as the absurdity of this novel in Joseph Andrews, 1742, and Shyamala. Subsequently, Fielding satirized Richardson's Clarissa, 1748, with Tom Jones, 1749. Tobias Smollett, 1721–1771, elevated the picaresque novel with works such as Roderick Random, 1748, and Peregrine Pickle, 1751. Thank you.